Imagine a king, the most powerful man in his kingdom, standing barefoot in the snow, no crown, no army, no throne, just a man shivering in a courtyard, begging a priest to forgive him. This actually happened. In January of 1077, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV stood outside a castle in the Italian Alps for 3 days in freezing temperatures, dressed in the rough wool of a penitent, waiting for Pope Gregory VII to grant him an audience. The most powerful secular ruler in Europe, reduced to a supplicant at a churchman's door. How did it come to this? How did a dispute over who gets to appoint bishops, a question that sounds almost bureaucratic, tear apart medieval Europe, humiliate emperors, and fundamentally reshape the relationship between church and state for centuries to come? And perhaps most importantly, why does the answer to that question still echo in the way we organize power today? Stay with us. This story is stranger, more dramatic, and more consequential than almost any war fought with swords. If you find yourself genuinely gripped by history told this way, without myths, without filler, just the real story, consider subscribing and hitting the like button. It genuinely helps us keep making these videos, and it tells us you want more. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To understand the Investiture Controversy, you need to understand something about medieval Europe that is deeply counterintuitive to modern eyes. In the 11th century, a bishop was not simply a religious leader. A bishop was one of the most powerful political figures in the land. Think about what a bishop actually controlled. He presided over vast tracts of land, sometimes entire regions, granted to the church over centuries by pious rulers and wealthy donors. He commanded loyalty from thousands of people. He collected taxes, administered justice, and in many cases he could raise an army. In a world where literacy was rare, the church also controlled education, record-keeping, and the drafting of legal documents. A bishop, in practical terms, was simultaneously a spiritual shepherd, a feudal lord, and a government administrator. This meant that whoever controlled the appointment of bishops controlled an enormous amount of political and economic power, and for most of the early medieval period, that control rested firmly with kings and emperors. The ceremony that made this concrete was called investiture. When a new bishop was appointed, the king or emperor would hand him a ring and a staff, the symbols of his office in a formal ritual. This act of investiture was the moment the bishop received his authority, and crucially, the king performed it before the church had conducted its own religious consecration. In other words, in the eyes of the secular world, a bishop's power came from the king first and from God second. For centuries, this arrangement worked well enough. Kings needed loyal administrators. The church needed protection and land. They scratched each other's backs. But by the mid-11th century, a new generation of reformers inside the church had begun to look at this arrangement and see something deeply, profoundly wrong. Here is where a popular myth needs to be addressed head-on. Many people assume the investiture controversy was primarily about corruption, about greedy kings selling church offices to the highest bidder. And yes, simony, the buying and selling of church positions was a genuine problem. But the reformers' ambitions ran far deeper than cleaning up corruption. What they were challenging was the entire theological and political architecture of medieval society. They were asking a question that had never been asked so directly before. Does secular power have any legitimate authority over sacred things at all? That question had the potential to overturn everything. The reform movement had been building inside the church for over a century, centered largely on the monastery of Cluny in what is now Burgundy, France. The Cluniac monks had developed a vision of a church purified, independent, and answerable only to Rome, not to local lords, not to kings, and certainly not to emperors. Their ideas spread quietly through the monasteries and cathedral schools of Europe, attracting brilliant, ambitious men who believed the church had been corrupted by its entanglement with secular power. By the 1830s and 1350s, these reformers had begun to reach the papacy itself. A series of reform-minded popes began pushing back against the old order, challenging the assumption that emperors had the right to appoint, or even approve, popes. In 1059, Pope Nicholas II issued a decree that transformed how popes would be chosen. From that point forward, the selection of a new pope would be handled by a body of senior church officials known as cardinals. The emperor's traditional role in the process was explicitly curtailed. This was not a polite administrative reform. It was a declaration of war on the old relationship between church and empire. The man who would bring this conflict to its explosive peak arrived in Rome in 2073. His name was Hildebrand, and he took the papal name Gregory VII. He was not a physically imposing man. Contemporary descriptions suggest he was short, with an unremarkable appearance. But inside that small frame lived one of the most ferociously determined minds of the medieval world. Gregory believed, with absolute conviction, that the Pope was the supreme authority on earth, not just in spiritual matters, but in all matters. He articulated this in a document called the Dictatus Papae, written in 1075, which contained 27 extraordinary propositions. Among them, that the Pope alone could appoint or depose bishops, that the Pope could depose emperors, that the Pope's legates outranked all bishops everywhere, and perhaps most provocatively, that the Pope himself could not be judged by any human authority. Read those propositions today and they sound like the manifesto of a would-be theocratic dictator. In the context of the 11th century, they were something more complex, a radical but internally coherent vision of a world ordered by divine law, administered by the Church, with secular rulers serving in a subordinate, ministerial role. Gregory was not inventing these ideas from nothing. He was drawing on centuries of theological tradition. But he was the first pope with both the will and the political position to try to act on them systematically. On the other side of this collision stood Henry IV, King of Germany and Holy Roman Emperor. Henry was, by the standards of his age, a capable and energetic ruler. He had spent much of his reign suppressing rebellions, managing fractious German princes, and trying to consolidate imperial power in Italy. He was also a man who had grown up in a world where the emperor appointed bishops as a matter of course, and he saw no reason whatsoever to change that. The two men were, in a sense, mirror images of each other. Both were convinced they were right. Both were willing to push the conflict to extremes, and both had enough support among their respective constituencies to make a catastrophic collision almost inevitable. The trigger came in 1075 over the appointment of the Archbishop of Milan. Milan was one of the most important cities in northern Italy, and its archbishop was one of the most powerful church figures in the region. Henry appointed his own candidate. Gregory rejected the appointment and demanded Henry submit to papal authority on the matter. Henry refused. Gregory threatened to excommunicate him. Henry, in a move of breathtaking boldness, convened a council of German bishops at Worms in January 10,000 sexties and had them declare Gregory deposed as pope. Gregory's response was swift and devastating. He excommunicated Henry IV, he declared Henry stripped of his royal authority, and he released all of Henry's subjects from their oaths of loyalty to him. Now, here is where you need to understand something about medieval society that makes this moment genuinely explosive. Excommunication was not simply a religious penalty. In a world where the Church administered the sacraments, baptism, marriage, last rites, and where eternal salvation was understood as a real and urgent concern, being cut off from the Church was a social and political catastrophe. Henry's subjects were no longer bound to obey him. His enemies, and he had many, now had theological cover to rebel. The German princes, who had long resented imperial power, began circling. Within months, Henry's position had become desperate. The German princes announced that if Henry could not get his excommunication lifted within a year, they would elect a new king. Henry had no good military options. Gregory had outmaneuvered him completely, and so, in the bitter January of 10,077, Henry IV made a decision that stunned contemporaries and has fascinated historians ever since. He crossed the Alps in winter, a genuinely dangerous undertaking, and travelled to the castle of Canossa in northern Italy, where Gregory was staying. He arrived dressed as a penitent. He stood in the courtyard for 3 days, and he waited. Gregory, faced with a genuinely difficult dilemma, eventually granted Henry absolution. As Pope, he could not in good conscience refuse absolution to a penitent sinner. But the political calculation was brutal. By lifting the excommunication, Gregory had saved Henry from immediate political destruction. Henry returned to Germany, reasserted his authority, and within a few years was back to appointing bishops as before. Historians have argued ever since about who actually won at Canossa. Gregory had achieved the extraordinary spectacle of an emperor doing penance before a pope, a symbolic victory of almost incalculable significance. But Henry had survived. He had played the penitent card brilliantly, using Gregory's own theological framework against him. The war between them continued. Henry eventually installed his own rival pope, called an antipope, and Gregory died in exile in 1085, reportedly saying, "I have loved righteousness and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." It is one of the most haunting exit lines in medieval history. Whether he actually said it is disputed by historians, but it was recorded by contemporaries and reflects the genuine tragedy of his final years. But here is the thing about the investiture controversy that makes it genuinely different from a simple power struggle between two stubborn men. The conflict did not end with Gregory's death. It continued for nearly 50 more years, grinding through the reigns of multiple popes and emperors, reshaping the political landscape of Europe with every decade that passed. The German princes used the chaos brilliantly. Every time the emperor was weakened by his conflict with the papacy, they extracted more concessions, more autonomy, more power. The conflict that began as a theological dispute about bishops was simultaneously fueling the fragmentation of imperial power in Germany, a fragmentation that would have profound consequences for German history, stretching all the way to the modern era. Germany would not achieve political unification until 1871, nearly 8 centuries later. The roots of that fragmentation run, in part, through the fields of the investiture controversy. Italy told a different story. The conflict accelerated the rise of independent city-states in northern Italy, Milan, Florence, Venice, Genoa, as local powers filled the vacuum left by a weakened empire. These city-states would become the cradle of the Renaissance. The intellectual and artistic explosion of the 14th and 15th centuries was nurtured in precisely the political environment that the investiture controversy helped create. The resolution, when it finally came, arrived not with a bang, but with a careful, lawyerly compromise. In 1122, Pope Calixtus II and Emperor Henry V signed the Concordat of Worms. It was, in essence, a deal that split the concept of investiture in two. The emperor would no longer invest bishops with the ring and staff, the spiritual symbols of their office. That would be handled by the church alone. But the emperor could still invest bishops with the scepter, a symbol of the temporal, political authority and the lands that came with the office. In Germany, this secular investiture would happen before the religious consecration. In Italy and Burgundy, it would happen after. It sounds like a technical compromise, and in one sense it was. But the implications were enormous. For the first time in European history, a formal distinction had been drawn between spiritual authority and secular authority, between the power of the church and the power of the state. The two were not the same thing. They operated in different spheres, and they could be separated, at least in principle. This is the moment that many historians identify as one of the key intellectual foundations of what we now call the separation of church and state. Not the French Revolution, not the Enlightenment. A document signed in the German city of Worms in 1122 by two exhausted negotiators trying to end 50 years of chaos. The Concordat did not create a peaceful coexistence between church and empire. The conflicts continued in different forms for centuries. But it established a conceptual framework that would prove extraordinarily durable. The idea that spiritual and secular authority were distinct, that each had its own legitimate sphere, that neither could simply absorb the other, that idea entered the bloodstream of European political thought and never left. Consider what this meant for the long arc of Western history. The investiture controversy forced medieval thinkers to develop sophisticated theories of political legitimacy. If a king's authority did not come simply from the church's blessing, where did it come from? From the people? From natural law? From God directly, bypassing the church? These questions, forced into the open by the conflict over bishops, fed directly into the political philosophy of the high medieval period, which in turn fed into the Renaissance, the Reformation, and eventually the Enlightenment. There is a direct, traceable line of intellectual cause and effect from Gregory VII's Dictatus Papae to the political theories of John Locke. It runs through the crisis of papal authority, through the conciliarist movement of the 14th century, through the Protestant Reformation's challenge to Rome, and finally into the liberal political tradition that underlies modern democratic governance. That is a remarkable journey for a dispute that began over who hands a bishop his ring. The investiture controversy also transformed the church itself in ways that proved deeply consequential. The reform movement that Gregory championed did succeed in creating a more centralized, more legally sophisticated, and more independent papacy. The 12th and 13th centuries saw the papacy at the height of its power and institutional development. Canon law, the Church's own legal system, became one of the most sophisticated legal frameworks in the world, and trained lawyers from across Europe came to study it. The Church, in trying to defend its independence from secular rulers, became more like a state itself, hierarchical, bureaucratic, and legally complex. This is one of history's great ironies. The reformers who wanted to purify the Church from political entanglement ended up creating an institution that was, in many ways, more politically powerful and more institutionally complex than ever before. Power, it seems, has a way of reshaping even those who seek to escape it. There is one more wow fact worth pausing on, because it reveals just how deeply this conflict reshaped everyday life in medieval Europe. At the height of the Investiture Controversy, the question of which pope or antipope was legitimate, and therefore which bishops they had appointed were legitimate, directly affected whether ordinary people's marriages were valid, whether their children were legitimate heirs, and whether the last rites administered to the dying were spiritually effective. The theological and political crisis filtered all the way down to the most intimate moments of human life. People genuinely did not know, in some regions, whether the priest performing their wedding was properly ordained. That is how thoroughly this conflict penetrated medieval society. And yet, out of that confusion, something new emerged. The very act of arguing, in councils, in legal documents, in theological treatises, in political pamphlets, forced medieval Europeans to develop new tools of reasoning about authority, legitimacy, and the proper limits of power. The Investiture Controversy generated an extraordinary burst of political and legal writing. It was, in a strange sense, a school for political thought, taught through the brutal curriculum of a 50-year crisis. Gregory VII died in exile. Henry IV died fighting his own son, who had rebelled against him, a rebellion encouraged in part by the papacy. Neither man achieved the total victory he sought, but together, locked in their furious struggle, they cracked open questions that European civilization would spend the next millennium trying to answer. The man kneeling in the snow at Canossa was not simply humiliated. He was standing at the hinge point of a transformation. Behind him lay a world where sacred and secular power was so intertwined that they were barely distinguishable. Ahead lay a world, still centuries away, still unimaginably distant, where those two spheres would be formally, legally, constitutionally separated. The road from Canossa to the modern secular state is long, winding, and full of catastrophes, but it is a road, and it begins here. The war over bishops was never really about bishops. It was about who gets to define the source of legitimate authority. Kings and popes fought over it with armies and excommunications. Philosophers fought over it with ideas. Reformers fought over it with conscience. And in a very real sense, we are still fighting over it today, in debates about religious freedom, about the role of faith in public life, about the limits of state power over conscience. History, at its best, does not just explain the past. It hands you a lens for understanding the present, and the lens ground in the conflict between Gregory VII and Henry IV, in the courtyard at Canossa, in the corridors of Worms, in the 50 years of argument and agony between them, is one of the sharpest lenses we have. What do you think was the real turning point in this conflict? Was it Gregory's decision to excommunicate Henry, the moment that showed the papacy could actually bring an emperor to his knees? Or was it Henry's walk to Canossa, the moment that revealed how a clever ruler could turn theological rules against the Pope himself? Write your answer in the comments. Genuinely curious what you think. If you found this story as gripping as we hoped, subscribing to the channel is the single best way to support what we do here, deep history, properly told without myths or filler. We put real work into every video, and your subscription is what makes that possible. In the next video, we are going to follow this story into its next great chapter, the moment the papacy reached the absolute peak of its power and the forces that were already gathering to bring it crashing down. It is a story involving plague, schism, and one of the most bizarre episodes in the entire history of the Catholic Church. You will not want to miss it. But before we get there, let us sit with one final dimension of this story that often gets overlooked: the human cost paid by the people caught between these two colliding systems of power. When a region found itself in the middle of a disputed investiture, when two rival bishops both claimed the same see, the consequences for ordinary people were not abstract. Parish churches closed, sacraments were withheld, Interdict, the church's nuclear option, which suspended all religious services across an entire territory, could descend on a population for years at a time. No masses. No baptisms performed in church. No Christian burial for the dead. In a society where the rhythms of the church year structured everything, the agricultural calendar, the market days, the festivals, the very measurement of time itself, an interdict was not a symbolic punishment. It was a dismantling of the social fabric. Estimates vary, but historians believe that during the most intense decades of the Investiture Controversy, significant portions of Germany and northern Italy experienced some form of religious disruption lasting months or years. Entire generations grew up in regions where the legitimacy of their local clergy was genuinely in question. The psychological weight of that uncertainty, in a world where eternal damnation was understood as a real and proximate danger, is almost impossible to overstate from a modern perspective. And yet those same people did not simply suffer passively. The crisis forced lay people to think, perhaps for the first time in an organized way, about what the church was for, who it belonged to, and whether its authority was truly as absolute as it claimed. The seeds of later movements, the Waldensians, the various reform currents that would eventually feed into the Protestant Reformation, were watered, in part, by the disillusionment and questioning that the Investiture Controversy generated at the grassroots level. There is something almost paradoxical about this. Gregory VII launched his reform movement to elevate the church above the messy compromises of secular politics, to make it pure, uncontaminated, answerable only to heaven. But in fighting that battle so ferociously, he exposed the church to scrutiny it had never faced before. Once people began asking whether the emperor had the right to appoint bishops, it was only a matter of time before they began asking harder questions still. The reform that was meant to protect the church's authority ultimately contributed to the long process by which that authority would be questioned, challenged, and eventually, in much of Europe, rejected. That is the deepest irony of the entire story. Gregory VII, the man who wanted to make the church invincible, helped set in motion the forces that would make it vulnerable. Henry IV, the man who wanted to preserve the old order, helped crack it open beyond repair. Neither of them could see where the road led. They rarely can. History is not made by people who understand the full consequences of their actions. It is made by people who believe passionately in something, act on that belief with everything they have, and then leave the consequences for everyone else to sort out across the following centuries. Gregory and Henry believed passionately, they acted with everything they had, and we are still sorting out the consequences. What do you think was the real turning point in this conflict? Was it Gregory's decision to excommunicate Henry, the moment that showed the papacy could actually bring an emperor to his knees? Or was it Henry's walk to Canossa, the moment that revealed how a clever ruler could turn theological rules against the Pope himself? Write your answer in the comments. Genuinely curious what you think. If you found this story as gripping as we hoped, subscribing to the channel is the single best way to support what we do here, deep history, properly told, without myths or filler. We put real work into every video, and your subscription is what makes that possible. In the next video, we are going to follow this story into its next great chapter, the moment the papacy reached the absolute peak of its power and the forces that were already gathering to bring it crashing down. It is a story involving plague, schism, and one of the most bizarre episodes in the entire history of the Catholic Church. You will not want to miss it.